Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome all. My name is Sharon Wallishin. I'm a senior Power BI consultant with 3Cloud Solutions. And today we're going to talk about using data sets and data flows to govern corporate data. Every day in my job, I work with clients on this thorny topic of how to share data for different uses, and both data flows and data sets are great choices to accomplish this. And today we're going to talk about when to use which one and why. Prior to becoming a consultant, I worked as an accountant in a lot of different industries. I began in public accounting and did a lot of work in manufacturing and construction, nonprofits, restaurants, a wide range of industries, and learned a lot about accounting. As I began my consulting career, I began working with a consultancy that worked with a product called Dynamics CRM, which is now Dynamics 365 CRM. And I learned about the other really big stream of corporate data, the sales pipeline data. And now I concentrate my consulting work on both Power BI and Power Apps and where the two meet. And part of that practice includes knowing how to share like data sources across multiple uses in an enterprise environment. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's take a look at the agenda for today's session. We're going to talk about creating and sharing data sets, and then creating and sharing data flows. We're going to talk about considerations, limitations, and use cases for each. We're going to talk about governance topics, security and access, those kinds of issues. We're going to talk about the implications of using composite models, using more than one data set or more than one data flow in a single file. And then I'm going to remind you more than once, this will be the first reminder, you can join me live on November 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for a live Q&A. Well, let's first talk about why shared data sets and data flows are important in a Power BI tenant. One of the common errors that I see when I start working with new Power BI users is that I see a lot of different builders connecting to the same data sources again and again and again. We call it data siloing. You've got everybody connecting to the same data source. They're applying their own transformations, they're writing their own measures, and a lot of times when they deliver their reports are showing what should be the same thing, but they're slightly different because of the transformations and measures that they've built. And so the goal should be to create a single source of truth, and that's where data sets and data flows can really play an important role. They do it the same way by creating a single location for builders to access that data. The creation and the location of the single source of truth is slightly different. So with a shared data set, you have a data source that's connected to a file that's created in Power BI Desktop, just as you've always done it. And you create the data connections and the relationships among the queries, the row level security, the object level security, the measures, and then whatever visuals you need to test all that data stuff, right? So after all that's tested, you're going to split the file in two. You're going to keep the data relationships and the security and the measures in one file, and you're going to strip off the visualizations. You're going to publish that up to a dataset workspace in the Power BI service. That would be where any builder would connect to create their visualizations rather than connecting directly to the data source. A data flow works really similarly, only what we're going to do is we're going to actually build the data set out in the Power BI service using Power Query Online. After that's built, you're going to have to connect a file to it to test all of your data relationships. And from then on, builders will be connecting directly to the data flow that you built in the Power BI service. And then their combined files would include all the components, the data, the relationships, the measures, the security, and then all those visual components, all the visualizations, and all the bookmarks, filters, that kind of stuff. First, let's talk about creating data sets. You're going to do what you've always done. You're going to create a Power BI file using the Power BI desktop. It's going to include all the components. It's going to include your data connections and data relationships. It's also going to include any necessary row level or object level security. It's going to include any necessary measures. It's also going to include any visualizations that you need to test all of that data. After it's all stabilized, you're going to split that into two different files, one that just holds the model and one that just holds the visualizations. I'm going to walk you through how all that happens. So what you're looking at is a Power BI file, and my users are over the moon with this file. I've got everything tested, the visualizations are right as I want them, everything's ready to go. I'm ready to share this file. So what I want to do is I want to come up and I want to save my file with a new name, because I'm going to split the file. So instead of being AdWorks with visuals, I'm just going to call it the AdWorks model. The AdWorks model. And I'm going to save it. And then I just need to delete the visualizations. If I had multiple pages of visualizations, I could delete every page except for the last page by just completely deleting the page. But on the last page, you have to delete all the visualizations individually, and the best way to do that is to click in the canvas and do a Control A so that you've got handles on every piece of visualization there, and then you just click delete, and then you end up with a blank canvas. And then I'm going to save my file, and I'm just going to publish it. I've already created a workspace for publishing this. It's called Shared Datasets Demo, and I'm just going to select that and I'm going to publish it. So now when I come out and take a look at my workspace in the service, you can see I've got AdWorks model. I also have a report, because when you publish a file, you're automatically going to publish a report. And I want to just get rid of this report. So I'm just going to click the ellipsis and click delete, and it's gone. And now I want the first level of permissions for a shared data set is in the access area. So I'm going to come up and take a look at the access for my workspace. And I already have this set up, but the recommendation here is that you keep the number of people that can update your data set to a very small group. In this case, I'm the only one who can update this data set, and everybody else is in here as a viewer. And I typically tend to choose only those two roles, either admin or viewer. I don't mess around with contributors or members in this context. I want to keep the number of people that can modify my data set to a very, very small group, because if this data set ends up being shared over a lot of different reports, I don't want just anybody to be able to change my data set, because it can impact everybody's reports. But one thing you do need to remember is that anyone who's going to view this data in any report in any workspace is going to have to be added as a viewer in the dataset workspace. The second level of permissions on a shared data set happens in the Manage Permissions area that's behind the ellipsis next to the data set. And when you click that, you'll see everyone who you've granted access on the workspace access page listed. And if they are not admins, they'll have an ellipsis to the right of their name. When you click that ellipsis, you can see that there are two dataset permissions. The build permission seems pretty obvious to me. If you give them the build permission, that means that that user will be able to access the dataset and build their own content based on that dataset. This is the permission that will make the shared data set show up in the list of available data sets for that user when they use the Power BI shared data set connector. So when I work with clients and we're talking about dataset permissions, I typically recommend against ever allowing the reshare permission on a dataset user. And that is because if a user has the ability to reshare and they do that going forward in the tenant, any user that they reshare to gets automatically added to the access list of the dataset workspace. And typically in an enterprise tenant, that's going to upend some of the security that they may have put in place to restrict access to data. So if you think about the use of a shared data set over many reports, very, very often the content has a smaller audience than the data set itself. But as I told you earlier, anybody that wants to access content based on the shared data set has to be included as a viewer in the workspace data set. This typically means that the workspace that holds the data set has a broader access list than the workspaces that hold the content. And I typically recommend to clients that they separate the two. They keep the data set for that reason, right? They keep the data set separate from the content. Now that I've got all the security set up on the workspace, I need to go back to my Power BI file, the visual file, and I need to substitute in the new data source. So this is my visual file, and I'm just going to go into the Home ribbon and choose the Power BI Datasets connector. And that's going to bring up the list of all of the data sets that I have access to, which I have. This one comes up first. This first one is the one that I want. It's coming up first because of this endorsement, which we're going to talk about later in this session. So I'm going to go ahead and create that connection. It's telling me that I have access to these tables. I'm going to submit this for connection. It's actually going to create a direct query connection to that shared data set. Now over in the field well, you'll notice that I have duplicates of everything. Totally makes sense, right? Because both the shared data set and the original data source are the same. It's the same data source. So now I just need to go through all of the visualizations and I need to point them back to the new data source. So you just click on one visualization, and then what I like to do is I like to pick up the name of the data of the field and I type that in the search box. So English product name. And then you'll see I've got one in dim product and I've got one in dim product 2. So I just want to take the one from dim product 2 and I want to get rid of the one from dim product 1. And then you just go through and you do that with all of the other fields and you go through all the visualizations. It goes relatively quickly with this method. So once you've gone through all the visualizations and you've replaced the new data for the old data, then you can go back out into the query editor and you can delete all those queries. So I'm just going to come out and I'm just going to quickly delete them all. And takes a couple of seconds to delete them here. And then when you close this up, you'll have completed that substitution. And if you did it correctly, none of your visualizations will break. There we go. One more. All right. And so nothing's left in the query editor. I'm just going to close and apply. And it's going to have to quickly refresh. It should happen quickly because there's nothing there. Because this test data didn't include a date table, a local date table got automatically created, and I would clean that up. Probably in the real world, I'd end up creating a date table, but I want to get rid of these local date tables, and I'm just going to delete them from the model and fix that. I will mention, in addition, this same methodology that I used to separate these files to create that shared data set is methodology that we often use even if we don't know that the data set's going to be shared in the future, we separate the visuals from the model and create two files. It's a good best practice, so you might want to consider using this methodology for that as well. So with that, let's go back to slides. You might notice on my demo time slides, you may see links, and those are links to blog posts that go through a lot of what I showed in the demo. So let's do a quick review. So when I created the data sets, I used the Power BI desktop. I created a combined Power BI file like you normally do. I waited until everything was adequately tested, and then I split that into two files, one that held the model and one that held the visualizations. I published the model file, which included not only the data connections, but also the measures. And if there was row level security, I would have included that. I would have also included all the relationships between the tables. And that would be the model package. I published that to the workspace, and then I granted workspace access to everyone that needed to be able to see content based on that data set. And pretty much everyone gets added as a viewer, except for maybe one or two people that are going to be admins who are allowed to update that data set. Then I went back through and I granted builder permissions to those content builders that were included in the access list. Build will allow any user with that permission to see the shared data set when they click the Power BI shared data set connector. You also heard my reshare rant. Reshare should be allowed rarely, if ever. Reshare will create implicit access to the dataset workspace and undermine any access control that's established by the people that are controlling the tenant. So let's switch gears and talk about data flows now. I'm going to show you how to create a data flow, but first I want to talk about the difference between a data set and a data flow. A shared data set, the data lives in some source, either on-prem or online, and it's being imported into a data set that's connected to a Power BI file and then published to the Power BI service. With a data flow, the data gets imported into the Power BI service for storage or to Azure Gen 2 data lake storage. When you connect a Power BI file to a data flow, it actually creates a data set connected to a data flow. Very, very confusing language, right? I get that. Every Power BI file report has a data set. Sometimes that data set is data that lives somewhere else. Sometimes that data set is data that lives in a data flow. So let me show you real quickly how you create a data flow. I'm out in that workspace that I was in before, and I'm just going to click New and create a new data flow. And you'll notice there are 4 ways to create a data flow. You can define your own tables, which is what we're going to do. You can link to tables in other data flows in other workspaces. You can import a model, which is a very handy technique if you want to move a data flow from one workspace to another. We'll talk about it in a second. And you can connect to data that lives in the common data model, which is also called the common data service or Dataverse. So I'm going to click Add New Tables. And this should look a little bit familiar because the first thing we're going to see is all the connectors that are available. And you can search for connectors here, but I don't need to search because the connector that I want is the Excel workbook. I don't believe that there are any connectors that exist in Power Query in Power BI Desktop that don't exist in this Power Query Online. I believe all the connectors are the same. And then I'm going to give it a path to a file on my OneDrive. I could also browse to my OneDrive. And then I need to be sure that I'm connected to my account. So I need to sign in. I'm already signed in. It's just making sure I'm signed in. And there we go. And then once I have a connection, I get a next button. Now, if this had been an on-prem source rather than an online source, the next button would not light up until I connect the on-prem source to a gateway. Now, I have a gateway installed on this machine, and you can see it right here, but you don't need a gateway connection if it's an online source. You only need a gateway with an on-prem source. I'm going to click Next. I choose all of the queries that I want from my source, and I can pick and choose. I don't have to choose them all, just like with a data set. And I'm going to go ahead and see that you can see that I have preview for each query. Now, depending on the size of the query, these previews can take, a little bit longer to come up. And then once I've chosen some queries to pull into my data flow, the transform button lights up. So I'm going to click that. And now you'll see the interface that really looks like the query editor. It's got the same menu ribbons. It's got most of the same commands. There are some commands that you cannot use online that you can use in the query editor in Power BI Desktop. And you see all my queries. And the same kind of stuff happens. You know how when you bring in a query into Power BI Desktop, the headers get promoted automatically. There's some stuff that happens in the background. That's what all this blinking is about. One thing that you do see in the Power Query Editor online is when you change queries, if you'll notice down here where it says completed, if I go to a different query, that's going to count up the runtime to pull that query in. And sometimes, like, these are going really quickly because they're very spare queries, but if you've added a lot of steps to your query, that runtime can take a lot of time. But one thing to remember is that the runtime that you see here is the load time. It's not the query time. So you still want to keep your queries efficient, but don't think that the time that it's taking to load these queries is the actual query time. It's really the load time. So once you're done, you can save and close, and then it's going to validate. Now, if you've thrown incremental refresh on one of the queries in this data flow, then this validation step can really take a long time. So I always wait to throw that on until I've got everything done and tested. And I'm just going to go in and I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to call it test data flow, and I'm going to save it. Now you see a refresh now button, and it's going to disappear really quickly. I'm purposely waiting for that so I can show you how to refresh it without that. I'm going to go back out to the workspace, and there's my data flow, and there's my refresh button. So I'm going to launch a refresh. One thing to remember about data flows, even though we saw the data preview in the query editor, there's no data in this data flow. So you have to refresh it before there's going to be any data in it. And these refreshes can take time depending on how much data we're talking about. So, give yourself the time to be able to do that. But while that refresh is running, I want to talk about access. So remember when we talked about shared data sets, we had that manage permissions where we could identify users that were builders or had the reshare permission, which we aren't going to use, right? With data flows, you don't get that. There are no permissions. So the only level of security for your data flow is in the access. So everybody in my access list is going to have access to this data flow, and it follows the permissions that go with this role. So if I had members or contributors or other admins, those people would be able to change my data flow. You want to keep, just like with the data set, you want to keep the people that can change your data flow to the bare minimum. If this data flow is going to be used by a lot of different users across a lot of different workspaces, you don't want anybody to just be able to come in and change your data flow because it can impact all of those uses. If one of those users had been a a member or a contributor or an admin, they would be able to open up my data flow. If they're a viewer, they would get a message that says you don't have permission to change this data flow. But if they're a contributor or a member or an admin, they would get a button that would allow them to take over my data flow. As soon as they take over my data flow, they're going to have to update the credentials for the data sources. And they're not going to be able to go forward until they do that. So the rule is do not take over a data flow unless you're certain that you have valid credentials to all the data sources, because you will break it. All right, so let's go back and let's talk about settings. So there is a settings. Oh, this is the export JSON I was talking about. If I wanted to move this data flow from one workspace to another, I would export JSON and it would create a file that would live on my hard drive. And then I would go back up here and I would go to data flow and I would use this connector, import model, and I would point it to that JSON file and it would pull in these data flows. You don't have to create them again. You only have to create them once. And that's a really handy trick. But let's talk about the other settings. So we already talked a little bit about the refreshes. But you can see my last refresh, and you can see a refresh history just like you can with a data set. And then there are data source credentials. There's a lineage view. You can schedule refreshes just like a data set. You can't control the enhanced compute engine settings, but they're already set at optimized. And you can endorse. So both data sets and data flows can carry either a promoted designation or a certified designation. And when I connected to my shared data set in Power BI Desktop, you saw that that shared data set had been promoted. And when you promote or certify either a data set or a data flow, when you open the connector and see the list of the data sets or data flows that you can connect to, the ones that are promoted or certified will float to the top. And that's what they're really great for. When I work with enterprise clients, we talk about the need to build a business process that identifies the criteria that identify what's promoted and what's certified. So, a certification may involve some certain characteristics. All the DAX has been tested, all of the M has been tested, certain levels. And then typically, if you have a business process in place for promotion and certification, in the tenant settings, you limit the people that can change this setting to the people that are monitoring the business process, right? You've got a group of people that are monitoring which data sets and data flows can be promoted and certified, and those are the only people that can change this setting. And so if I wasn't one of those people, this would be grayed out for me. So let's review. When you create data flows, you're going to be doing that using the Power Query editor online on the Power BI service. Before you're going to be able to create your data flow, you're going to have gateways access established for any on-prem data. You're also going to have valid credentials for any data source. Once you get your data flow created, the big gotcha is you're going to have to refresh it before you can use it in a report. Even though you can see the preview of the data in the query editor, there's no data in there until you do that first refresh. Also, I strongly recommend that if you're going to use incremental refresh, don't establish the incremental refresh until you've got everything established and tested, because the validation steps when you close your data flow are really drawn out when you apply incremental refresh. When we're talking about a data flow, the only security is in the workspace access window. So more than one data flow can live in a single workspace, but the same access list will apply to both. So best practices in terms of that access. I personally like to limit the access to only admin and viewer roles. You just need to keep in mind that admins, members, and contributors will have the ability to revise your data flow. And if that data flow is connected to a lot of reports in a lot of different workspaces, all of that content is going to be impacted by those changes. So you really want to limit that. You want to put content in different workspaces from the data flow workspace to allow you to limit the access on the content differently than the access to the data flow. If you take over a data flow, you must have valid credentials for all the data sources and the gateway access. It's going to be the first hurdle that you're going to have to cross in that takeover. So now that I've shown you how to create both shared data sets and data flows, let's talk about how they're the same and how they're different. This is a chart that I created that I've got included in a blog post that is made available to you in the slide deck. And it does a head-to-head comparison between shared data sets and data flows. As we've been talking about, they're very similar, but there are some important differences to keep in mind. And I just want to touch on the differences here because y'all will have access to the entire chart. First of all, only shared data sets can carry the measures with the data set. If you're connecting to a data flow, you'll have to create any additional measures inside of the Power BI file. And so those measures can't be repeated. And that can be a source of problems for the single source of truth. The next area of difference has to do with additional sharing controls. Remember, the dataset permissions, build and reshare, are only available for shared data sets. Those are not available for access to data flows, and the only controls that you're going to have on how data flows are accessed is in the roles on that workspace. The next area of difference has to do with how they're connecting. When you connect to a shared data set, that's automatically going to connect as a direct query, but you have to remember in that direct query connection that there's like a one-off kind of situation because the data set itself is connected to the original data source, and there's an import relationship there that will require refreshing, even though the connection to the shared data set is a direct query connection. When you connect to a data flow, you can connect either as an import, or if it's premium licensing connecting, you can connect with a direct query. This next difference that's listed in my chart is no longer true. It used to be that when you connected to data sets, you had to take all the queries as one. But since a recent update, you can now pick and choose among the queries in both data sets and data flows. However, you need to be careful when you do that, because if there are table relationships between tables that aren't included in your selection, you're going to have a broken model potentially. And then the next area has to do with row level and object level security. If the data always carries the same row level and object level security, you should always be choosing a data set, because that row level and object level security can be bundled into the model so that you can keep the continuity of that security with the data in all uses. Now, if the row level security or object level security is going to change based on the use of the data, that is either an argument for a data set that doesn't include row level security or a data flow. When you're creating a data flow, it can either be stored in the service, or it can be pushed to Azure Gen 2 Data Lake storage, and that may provide some savings for some tenants. For instance, if you're using a premium capacity tenant rather than a PPU licensed user, that tenant may benefit from pushing large data sets to Gen 2 storage. It may be cheaper for them to do that than to if they're at a place where they might need to increase the size of the capacity, they wouldn't necessarily need to do that if they could push this one large data set to Gen 2 storage. That's where the straddle would come, and you just need to evaluate those on a case-by-case basis. The next difference has to do with the number of different data flows or data sets that can be connected in the same Power BI file. And in both cases, you can connect multiple data flows or multiple data sets or mix and match the two in a single file. But when you're talking about more than one data set in a single file, there can only be one relationship that spans the two data sets, and that typically is going to be a design requirement that's going to make it unworkable. Whereas with data flows, you can connect multiple data flows with multiple relationships. Although quite honestly, I tend to put those queries in a single data flow for simplicity when they're going to be used that way. So let's talk about a few tips that apply to both data flows and shared data sets. First of all, I almost always recommend that you keep the data set in a workspace separate from the content. And that is because, if you'll remember, all of the content users have to be added as viewers in the data set workspace, and you only want to allow the content to be shared with those users that need that specific content. So that typically means that the data set workspace or the data workspace has a wider access group than the content workspaces. And so it's best to keep them apart. Also, it's very important to manage the changes to the data, and that happens with the access list. So I like to really limit the number of admin, member, and contributor users to those access lists because that is how you will control the changes to the data. And in fact, I very rarely use members or contributors in my access lists for data workspaces. Also, it's critical to notify content builders of any proposed changes. Let's talk specifically about changes. As I've said many times already today, but it really bears repeating, any changes to this data is going to impact all of the reports built on the data. And because of that, every single report builder needs to be notified of any prospective changes before they get made so that they can review the impact on their reports. And I like to use the lineage view on the data workspace to figure out who those people are. And another thing that I found works really, really well is to create an Office 365 or Teams group because that can really save you time. In fact, I really love the Teams approach quite a bit. Create a team for each shared data set or data flow group. And then whenever there's a prospective change to that data, you can post it in the team and people will see that, pretty close to being in real time, and you can really shorten those change cycles. Now, specifically, some best practices for shared data sets. Any changes to a file that involve the data, like formatting or new measures, changes to measures that already exist, that kind of stuff. I mean, even, taking the zeros off of dollar values and adding commas to numbers, all of that kind of formatting should happen in the model. So it's going to have to be a change to that shared data set to take impact. And the only changes that should get made at the individual file would be changes that only apply to a single piece of content. For instance, if you have a content builder that wants to create a measure that only specifically applies to his report, that would be a good use of composite modeling to allow that builder to create that measure. When it comes to data sets, the biggest limitation has to do with using multiple data sets in a single file. And that can be done using composite modeling, except the biggest problem here is that there can be only one relationship between the two data sets, and usually that's going to be a deal breaker. So in most of the engagements that I've worked with corporate clients, we end up recommending data sets more often than data flows. And there are a few reasons for that. First of all, a lot of times there's row level or object level security, and either of those types of security will always point in the direction of a shared data set. If there are a lot of measures or complex measures included in the data, you definitely want those measures to follow the data, and that can only happen with a data set. You want to use data sets if the model itself is complex or has a lot of queries involved. If you're working with citizen developers that have limited modeling experience, a shared data set will really cut through a lot of the need for technical expertise because the model itself is static. It's going to be whatever the shared data set modeler established it to be. And that will really help quite a bit with builders that have limited expertise. So now let's talk about some limitations of data flows. First of all, you can't connect query relationships, row level security, object level security, or measures to the data. And that is a problem if you want to create a single source of truth. Also, there's some functionality that's only available with premium licensing, whether it's a premium capacity or access by premium per user licensees. First of all, the enhanced compute engine's only available with premium licensing. That's going to reduce refresh times for some of those really expensive transforms like joins, distincts, filtering, group bys, those really expensive transforms. You can only grant direct query to data flow entities with premium licensing. This is a big one. You can only allow computed entities with premium licensing. That means that your data flows cannot include any merges or appends unless you have premium licensing. Another limitation to data flows, unless there's premium licensing, would be that you wouldn't be able to use linked entities from existing data flows. You can do that with premium licensing, and that can be really helpful because sometimes a data flow exists already that you want to use in a larger context, and you don't have to recreate that data flow or actually create a second instance of it on the tenant. You can just refer to the initial data flow if you have premium licensing. And then you can't do incremental refreshes on data flow entities unless there's premium licensing. So here are a few use cases for data flows. If you're working with extremely large data sets with premium capacities, it's possible that there could be some potential savings if your capacity is getting really close to the top of its ability to hold data. You may find a savings by moving a large data sets to Gen 2 storage rather than increasing the number of nodes in your premium capacity because they're pretty pricey. Another use case for data flows would be if the data resides in multiple locations, especially if there's a mix of on-prem and cloud data sources. I really love putting them together in a single data flow to make it easier for builders to be able to access the data in a single location. If the data needs extensive or advanced manipulation, it's better to do that kind of manipulation in the Power Query online rather than to do it in Power Query in the Power BI file. You just get more compute power with that data flow. However, that said, if there are extensive manipulations, the very best thing is to put it as close to the source, the initial source of the data, if possible. And so a lot of times that means staging queries in SQL, for instance, before they get pulled into the data flow. So if there's a need to see data flow back and forth between Power Apps and Power BI, data flows can really be great for that. I recently worked on a project where we created a model-driven Power App to do some data cleaning before data got reported, and we used a Power BI data flow to access the initial source of the data, and we did some manipulation there to clean the data a little bit. Then we pushed that data to a Power Apps data flow, which is they look and work exactly the same, only they're separate. I'm not sure why Microsoft has done that, but they have. You cannot access a Power BI data flow with Power Apps. We use then the Power App data flow to suck the data into the Power App, and then we pushed that data back out to a Power BI data flow to report it. So there was this system of data flows that cleansed, ingested, and then reported data. So we've talked a little bit about the security part of the governance of data flows and data sets, but there are a few other things that we need to talk about. First of all, there are a few tenant settings that really need to be in place for either shared data sets or data flows to work. There is a setting called create and use data flows. Nothing really has to be changed in most tenants for that one. Also, you need to enable the use data sets across workspaces setting, and that one is also defaulting to enabled, so it won't require a change. One that I like to get changed if I can is the tenant setting for blocking republish and disable package refresh. What that setting does is it will only allow the owner of the data set or data flow to publish a refresh. And I find that's a really good control over unwanted changes to shared data. Certification and promotion are really, really helpful, I think, but they need to be accompanied by a business process that establishes the criteria that need to be met for those designations, and only the reviewers of those criteria should be allowed to promote or certify data sets. And both of those are in the tenant settings as well. You can enable certification and promotion, and then there you can also establish a user group of people that can change that setting. So composite modeling is probably the biggest enhancement to Power BI that we've seen maybe ever, and places Power BI in a place way, way, way above any of its competitors. The composite modeling, it's kind of like what Spider-Man's father said, with great power comes great responsibility. I think it's really important with composite modeling to always remember that ETL is always going to be most efficiently made at the highest level closest to the source. So if you can make big changes, merges and appends and groupings, if you can make those changes at the source, that's more efficient. But if you can't do it there, then it's more efficient to do that at the data flow or shared data set level than to do it at the Power BI file level. So you just kind of want to keep that in mind when you're building your apps. When it comes to data sets, you want to consider making the changes that will apply for all the content in the shared data set rather than letting your builders kind of go rogue on making those kind of changes using composite modeling. No limitation to connections between multiple data flows in a single file. So you can put as many data flows in a single file as you want without any kind of modeling problem. And then just as a repeat, if you're putting multiple data sets in a single file, there's only one relationship allowed between those two data sets. So that's all the information that I've prepared for you in advance. Hopefully you'll mark your calendars and join us for live Q&A. If you have anything to add to this discussion or have any questions, I hope that I've provided enough information so that you can see that it's very easy to provide a single source of truth for builders that want to build on the same data by creating either shared data sets or data flows. I know you all have so many demands on your time. And I want to thank you for taking the time to take a look at this video. If you'd like to connect with me, there are several ways that you can do that. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. Please do. Please, if you've watched this and you learned something or you have anything to comment about what was there, what wasn't there, what was missing, what was right, what was wrong, please connect with me on LinkedIn and let me know. I'd love to hear your feedback there. Additionally, I blog at datastoriescloud.com. There are definitely several articles that have to do with this particular topic on my blog, and there are other articles as well. And then you can always email me at my email listed here. Thank you again, and if you have time, please go out to the evaluation site and evaluate this session. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.